Welcome back to the techno-communism conversation. This entire week I've been doing a show every day and tagging even more people. And the reason that I've started doing this a show about revolutionary cybernetic socialism and its implementation in the course of the 21st century using stratagems like the so-called AI agentariat, or the use of open source LLM models as a workforce multiplier and cognitive enhancer of a kind that could transform society in a few short years. The reason that I am doing this show every day is because a person from my a distant past, the man who raised me, who is a Eurocentric nationalist, a Christian nationalist, 7 other kinds of sick fuck nationalist, reached out to me, apropos of nothing, with the intention of telling me that I shouldn't be doing this kind of show, talking about this sort of thing. And before he even got into that, I hung up on him. But I suppose if this is making an impression on him that perhaps some of these ideas have gelled a little more than previous writing of mine, so I'm going to continue to do this show every day and tag more folks. I've been shadow banned and banned on every media of every kind, mostly for this very thing, talking about the need to build a humane and sustainable economic system that would stop the fascist United States from killing all of humankind. It shouldn't be a controversial thing, and yet most people are elitists, fascist sympathizers. They would say, I'm a capitalist. This man who raised me is not a capitalist. He has worked for someone else his entire life. He's a worker, but yet he has a near countless number of ridiculous fascist sympathies. He's a fascist sympathizer. I am going to talk a little bit about the concepts of the agentariat and the unfolding of institutions along those lines, and the concept of the previously best realized project along these lines, which did not use advanced LLM models or even anything approaching the supercomputer, but rather used telex machines, and it was Salvador Allende's Cybersyn project. And so this conversation could be called the Cybersyn Revolution 2.0, democratizing economic planning for the 2030s. Let's say that the 2030s is a time when an AI-run governance structure of the strength to stop Western fascists, so-called capitalists, from killing our species. That might be a time when we would have the organizing and computing power to do that. The global economic system faces challenges of a kind that are now undeniable. People like the aforementioned fascist sympathizer would tend to deny them a few years ago, namely capitalism's climate apocalypse. It's no longer really something that can be denied. It's something that, of course, they will deflect from, but it will not tend to be denied outright. Capitalism's climate apocalypse and problems very closely related, resource scarcity and rising inequality, all this demands a fundamental sea change in how we manage our lives, how we organize, and how we ultimately manage our economies. So inspired by the work of many folks, some of whom are still living, Salvador Allende took his own life at the point when the fascist Pinochet was about to destroy his work. Of course, that fascist Pinochet had been installed by the fascist U.S. But many of the young people at that time who worked on this project are still living. Perhaps the most famous of the people who worked on this project in cybernetics was Stafford Beer, a man who would not be described as a scientific socialist, as Salvador Allende might, although most people would stop short of calling Salvador Allende, say, a revolutionary cybernetic socialist. Although in certain situations, a person is revolutionary if they implement a revolutionary program, not based solely on their rhetoric. So this is a framework for building, discussing, and otherwise providing the necessaries for this Cybersyn 2.0, a real-time, decentralized, decentral planning, democratic economic planning powered by advanced computing in the 2030s. And I've talked quite a lot about subjects related to building the structures for the agentariat. I don't think I've talked enough about that, but I've talked a lot about it, so you can watch other shows on the subject, or shows from a month or two ago about the United Earth Directorate, what would be something like an organization that is able to uphold this full automation, effective post-scarcity world, which I think is around the corner if we are willing to build it and flip a coin if these ruling fascists don't get us all killed, which is a very big if, right? And you say, oh, maybe everybody doesn't die, maybe. Then that's kind of the sickest part of this, is that if everybody doesn't die, resulting from capitalism's climate apocalypse, which we will be locked into, after approximately 2030, if we do not abolish certain sectors and dramatically change the functioning of our economies, the sick part is maybe humanity doesn't go extinct. Maybe just the people who are actively causing this situation survive, because they have also monopolized the kind of resources that would allow them to have the versatility to escape that hellish set of circumstances. So that is something that all of these people know. So it would seem as if this situation is no different, in essence, from what, say, people like Christopher Columbus did in the early 1500s and 1600s, namely take over an island, forcibly enslave all of the inhabitants there, not feed them enough and work them to death in mines and on plantations, and then when the entire island was extinct, begin to export that system through the Catholic Church and other so-called institutions to other parts of the New World, and repeat the process with enslaved African Americans brought to those locales through the transatlantic slave trade. But particularly the island, which had people on it who were doing fine, and then a very short number of years later had no people on it, no native inhabitants. That's basically what today's far-right capitalists, neoliberals, ruling elites, all of these fascist people, I said on the last show, not all of these people are independently wealthy. So, in 1940, someone might go to work for the Rand Corporation for $30,000. Today, someone might go and work to be a think tank rat of another kind for $150,000, $200,000. That's not a lot of money to be complicit in this omnicide, but they do it for the love of fascism. Like this man who raised me, who for a lot of years thought that he would never be able to retire from his work because he wouldn't be able to afford the insulin that he needs. So this person is a computer scientist a pretty highly paid professional, but even that sort of person not in a position to ever retire under this fascistic system. You might be looking out for fascists, as most of you are in many ways without realizing it. Fascists aren't looking out for you. They're not returning the favor there. And I mentioned that this person had a collection of fascist sympathies of a ridiculous kind. Also, being a computer scientist for as long as I can remember, that kind of puts him in my thinking among the techno-fascists of the tech world that I often criticize in these social media and podcasts and such. Even though he wouldn't identify as that if you fulfill those conditions, being a fascist and working in tech, in my view, you're some kind of techno-fascist. This model, characterized by far-right neoliberalism, unfettered market forces, unhinged market forces, not merely unfettered, but completely psychotic, killing the planet. These people, perhaps they do this Christopher Columbus coup de grace, where some millions of them survive, but by and large they will not survive. Their loved ones will not survive under this omnicide, something that people really don't seem to comprehend. It's this problem of such scale and magnitude that they can't think about it. So these people, it's an unfettered neoliberal finance capital marketplace and an unhinged finance capital marketplace, such that even the people who would be believed to benefit the most from this system will not in effect benefit from it, because in a few short years they and their descendants will be gone from this earth along with all or most of humankind. So this near certainty of spiraling environmental degradation and the continuing widening wealth gaps and general instability of a variety of other kinds threaten social cohesion, such as it is, and any chance at sustainability in these systems for human beings. Our current economic system incentivizes practices that contribute overwhelmingly to this runaway overheating of our planet. The United States military-industrial complex is, in fact, the world's worst polluter, worse than British Petroleum, Shell Oil, and company. But of course, its only real job besides being a fascist bully on the world stage is to be a fascist bully to protect these other super polluters. It doesn't help any human beings domestically or foreign, except the ruling elites. And even the petty bourgeois or a labor aristocracy supporting this global ecocidal fascist regime, like I mentioned a moment ago with this man who raised me, don't see much benefit from it, or see some benefit, but and then some loss, a dubious benefit. So a radically new approach is needed to prioritize a transition to a humane and sustainable economic system, which requires the end of finance capital. Can't be done without this. And the people who would say that they would reform a system but allow something like finance capital to continue to exist have no desire to actually reform the system. They have a desire to continue to work within this dysfunctioning system as long until the moment that we are all dead. It's not the same thing. There's never been a starker illustration of the difference between blissfully ignorant moral cowardice in contrast with a lack of physical cowardice, right? You'd be cooked in an oven by the year 2050, let's say, or 2060. In some places sooner. This Last summer, in a part of the Middle East, temperature reached about 160 degrees. That is a temperature at which mammalian life cannot survive if that temperature is sustained. So people are not really seeming to understand that they're going to be cooked alive, or responding to that with appropriate action or even any fear at all. This contrast between the moral cowardice of the elitist, the brainwashed, and the lack of physical cowardice is quite striking. I'm hard pressed to think of anything in history quite like it. It's a product of something like Project Mockingbird, or the brainwashing mechanisms of the United States and fascist West. And in all of this, the gap between the rich and poor is continuing to widen, leading to a greater and greater social unrest and political instability. This is the crucible out of which real revolutions are born, not the impulse of the reformist, not the impulse of regimes micromanaged by professional managerial class or petty bourgeois collaboration with big bourgeois or labor aristocracy collaboration of that kind, but the people, celebrities, CEOs, these people cannot save you. Only the people, people's organization, and ultimately a people's government that abolishes private wealth and things like finance capital and this ecocidal set of regimes. Only this can save you. A more equitable distribution of resources is therefore critical for a sustainable system, for a humane and sustainable economic system, and for the thriving society that could be born out of this advanced computing takeoff. As I described, in Salvador Allende's time in the 1970s, they were using old technology for that time to build a sophisticated and working planned economy, and it would have worked had it not been sabotaged by fascists who wanted to prevent that very sort of thing. It's analogous to what happened in 1917 when the first scientific socialist government was signing its constitution and being established, and these North Atlantic powers formed into a kind of Voltron of fascism and imperial violence to stop this government from being formed, resulting in the so-called Russian Civil War that lasted for 6 years and led to many, many deaths. And all of this was to do the same thing, to prevent the public from being able to imagine a different system, and that unfortunately has succeeded quite admirably. When you think about the Soviet Union, if you're not a hardline scientific socialist, you probably do not imagine what occurred from approximately 1923 to the early 1950s, a doubling of life expectancy and a little more, and the building of a country of basically backwards peasants into a country of tremendous industrial output run by engineers and scientists. You do not imagine that doubling, which is a fourfold increase in the pace of such benefits seen under industrial capitalism, occurring in about a century rather than about a quarter of a century. And that's the most crucial thing that you can know about the scientific socialist planned economy, is that it is 4 times more efficient. And so because of that, because of the possibility of that outcome undermining the imperial forces, you have heard all manner of ridiculous things about the Soviets of that time, most notably in this kind of conversation, Joseph Stalin. You can't turn on a single tech podcast anywhere in the West and not have someone, if they would comment on what the potential for authoritarian misuse of advanced technology. They're not talking about Google being a massive military contractor and surveillance state mechanism. They're not talking about the military-industrial complex of the United States being the world's worst polluter, protecting other super polluters solely. They would talk about the enemies of of the United States as being problematic in that respect. So that's a product of this specifically anti-communist brainwashing that's not ubiquitous. The entire world is not the North Atlantic powers and their idiot citizens. I am reading a book by Roland Bohr about socialism with Chinese characteristics, and in that there's a quote from perhaps a former Prime Minister Deng, where he talks at some length about how the phenomena of the political institutions of the west part, the northwestern part of the Eurasian continent, should not be viewed as a significant phenomena, but rather a historical aberration. And there's a little more that goes into that conversation, but that is 100% accurate. Western Europe is not the world, and this global omnicidal regime that the North Atlantic powers, particularly the United States, the UK, France, force upon the rest of us, is not a force of God, is not a force of nature that cannot be defeated. All of these people have names and addresses. All of us have the power to organize and build a thing that in the next a few years, by say 2030, will be able to stop this grand genocide, capitalism's climate apocalypse. Going back to Chile and the development of this project from approximately 1971 to 1973, this was a pioneering attempt at real-time economic planning using cybernetic systems, that cybernetic, in as few words as possible, could just be used interchangeably in most cases with a term systems theory. So this requires a certain kind of technological sophistication. It doesn't really require the kind of technological sophistication, obviously, as I've said, that we presently have. So we would be fools in a world where we have encroaching AI agency in 2024 not to organize, to use this to build an actual economic system, political economy that would not kill the planet. But there's no excuse. You might say, oh, there was an excuse in the 70s to not do this. This technology was pretty simple. That's, in my view, flawed. And the most noted, perhaps, cybernetic socialist, Paul Cockshaw, that's kind of his whole thing, is that all of that could be done with systems much simpler than those that we have. Nevertheless, what we have now, we would be fools not to use it in this way. But almost every technologist that you will encounter is being pretty willfully obtuse on that score. They will tend to talk about how the benefits from this would derive from something like the DARPA pipeline, into which trillions over the years are dumped, public resources, all of basically to develop projects of dubious value that are then appropriated, put into private coffers. That is generally the habit of finance capital, is socialism, but socialism for the rich, stealing from the poor and giving to the rich effectively in every area. So Cybersyn envisioned workers participating in this sophisticated, if rudimentary by our standards, economic planning through a network of interconnected terminals. And this, there's an awful lot of reading that you can read about if you truly want to understand this kind of economic planning. The kind of economic planning that I tend to describe on this show you would probably at first glance say that it is more of an anarcho-syndicalist kind. I'm not an anarcho-syndicalist. I'm a state socialist and a supporter of scientific socialism. That is, but we have to build a thing that is versatile and that is able to kind of run in incognito mode in certain respects with respect to these fascist forces, so that we would, so in its earliest stages, the AI agentariat would look like something that is merely doing some humanitarian work using this workforce multiplier and cognitive enhancer, and then as it grows to the requisite number of users, say 10 million, then it begins to become something that could supplant these stodgy fascistic institutions. So the decentralized and democratic, so-called democratic qualities of this relative to, say, the Allende Cybersyn project is not, it should not be seen as ideologically driven, but rather a strategic necessary for doing this in such a way that it will not just immediately be murdered by fascist forces. That is the power of open source technology, in my view, is that it can transform begin to transform these systems without running into ratcheting up direct conflict with the imperial powers in a way that you would describe. I described on the show a few times how the USSR developed in 1948 nuclear weaponry to basically stop the United States from just keeping doing what they did in 1945, bombing a few 100,000 civilians with nuclear weapons every few years, which they would have done if that hadn't happened in 1948. They were petitioning other powers who say, "Hey, France, you're angry at Vietnam. You're pretty angry at China. Why don't we give you a nuclear weapon and you nuke them? Then, we won't be the ones, even though we are the ones who did it. We won't be seen as the ones who did it." So the USSR was unfortunately drawn into this Cold War, and in doing so, saved potentially many tens of millions of lives, but also arguably sealed the fate of the USSR. This could be one theory of why the USSR does not exist today, but China does, because they've not been drawn into this rigged fascist game. Potential benefits for Cybersyn Revolution 2.0. Of course, the primary things for building a humane and sustainable, I won't say of course, it's debatable, for building a humane and sustainable economy is sustainability. If we don't have a world to live on, there's no longer a need for a conception of proletariats and bourgeoisie. There's no more humans. But by optimizing our resource allocation and promoting 100% sustainability in all sectors, we can reverse the effects of climate change and transition to a circular economy. This is not something that's being done, despite what you might think about green technology in the West. That is largely an unmeaningful concept. The laundering of public opinion for private enterprise without actually doing anything. There would then, of course, be humanity, reduced inequality. Real-time data can be used to identify inequalities and implement policies for more equitable distribution of resources. You can imagine even on recent shows I talked about this in other angles, but you can imagine even a small number of thousands of users of this emerging AI agentariat network able to begin to do this sort of work. So, for example, you realize that the city of Lagos, the quality of life in the city of Lagos is dramatically made worse by the lack of potable water. And some hundreds of thousands of people, however, could design and build using this open source LLM framework, wherein much of the designing and even the organizing and implementing of the labor itself would be done by the AI agent. The AI agents would be specially modified to collaborate with one another. And so the users, the actual human workers in that system, would have very few responsibilities. This could effectively be a click-through process. This is effectively something you could be doing when you're asleep, in your pajamas, answering a few yes or no questions, or the principle of that throughout the course of a day or week. This degree of efficiency would allow for transformation in production and distribution systems, leading to a true economic growth, not the kind defined by the barometers of private wealth, and improved resource management. The change in the transparency of systems would also allow for real economic decision making, not what is basically just enterprise corruption on a transcontinental scale, fostering truth in institutions and trust of human beings, of the institutions that actually exist, something that does not really exist in the West. Democratic or representative participation in this kind of economic planning would then strengthen the social cohesion and promote a sense of ownership over the future. This is something that we absolutely need. Something like a Cybersyn, as I mentioned, the original Cybersyn was developed and began to be implemented from 1971 to 1973. So we need to begin building this now, because no matter the form it takes, it does take time to build such things. Well, I had some other notes on some more particulars there, but I'll just come to an end, because I'm trying to keep these shows to about 30 minutes. The Cybersyn revolution presents a necessary and bold vision for a human future where we do not face a multi-billion person loss of life. That requires embracing not merely the abolition of private wealth and the demolition of finance capitalists, but specific technological advancements. Advanced computing, so-called AI, is the most powerful revolutionary tool that has ever existed. This is not generally acknowledged by the revolution-minded, and we fail to acknowledge this at to our great harm, because, as I've said, we have less than 5 years to dramatically transform all systems before we are locked into a climate apocalypse death spiral. But we can realistically create a more just, sustainable, and a prosperous set of economic systems, and ultimately political economy for generations to come. So I hope this conversation inspires you to begin to help to develop. You can contact me and say I want to work on this with you, and we'll do that. Or maybe do your own outreach and your own research. By incorporating this and respecting the what Cybersyn did in the 1970s and what it could have been, we can undertake the Cybersyn 2.0 revolution in our time. The kind of thing, this AI agentariat, open source LLM run systems possessing agency of a kind that has not existed in creatures other than human beings for our purposes prior to this time. It does now exist in 2024. It's tending to be held back in high-end computer science labs. They're afraid of it for this very reason, for this very set of reasons. But the thing that they're afraid of course, that's why these people will tend to characterize AI as an existential risk. It's not an existential risk to humankind. It's perhaps the thing most likely to save humankind from its extinction. It's an existential risk to finance capital, which they care about more than their own lives. And so that's why they would lie about this. It's the most popular tech CIA talking point. But we can use this to build a humane and sustainable economic system in the spirit of that which was built by Salvador Allende before it was sabotaged by the fascist United States.